Before starting this video, I thought of various ways to approach this question that I get as often as any other, if not the most often. Why bother learning dead languages? First of all, it depends on your definition of dead. If by dead you mean first language on an everyday level, the one you use to engage in discourse, to buy things at the market, and so on, yeah, ancient Greek and Latin are dead. But if by dead you mean irrelevant, then we're getting onto subjective terrain. Then we're getting onto terrain where it requires a philosophical approach to figuring out what matters most to you in your life. If what you care most about is getting a big house and getting a lot of money, then classics may not be for you. Dead languages, so called, may not be for you. If, on the other hand, you're an artist, a creative person, someone who values subtlety of expression, it may very well be the only thing you should major in if you're in college, or that you should bother spending your time on when you read literature. Why is that? I'm going to try, in the scope of a fairly short video, to explain what I mean by this. Horace is a Roman lyric poet, and he has the good fortune of having been born into a society in which the first language is what is now to us a dead language, but which to him was quite alive, not only literarily as for us, but also on an everyday level, the way, for example, English might be for you today. So what was it that Horace, as a poet, as a lyric poet, was able to get away with, if you will, as an artist, by having use of this language called Latin? What was it about the language? What was it intrinsically about the language that enabled him to do creative things with words in a way that is not as easy to do so, if possible at all, in a modern language? And if I can show you a very simple example of a much broader phenomenon and process involved in what the poet was able to do, maybe you will start understanding a bit better why, number one, it is that ancient Greek and Latin are not dead by any means, insofar as this kind of thing matters to you. But number two, the question should not be why bother learning, but how can you get through your life without at least learning one of these so-called dead languages, for reasons that I'll get to now. The way to approach this question of why bother learning a dead language is to understand that the deadness of the language is extrinsic to its nature. The intrinsic nature of these languages, on the other hand, is something different from merely dead. And so when we call them dead languages, we might as well step back, look at this other thing I'm about to mention, and maybe rename them, reflecting this quality, this aspect of them. And what aspect is that? You ready? Not very popular in the world we live in now. Difficult. Difficult for its own sake. That is, reflective of the complexity of reality in such a way that it comes closer to being able to grapple with the more subtle depths of reality offered to our perusal through mental activity, most conspicuously through philosophical discourse, poetic discourse, the use of words not only to convey meanings, but to become embodied as sculptures, if you will, in their own right. Things, they become reified. Words become things the more they matter in their specificity in a line of poetry. Let me get a little less abstract now. What I'm saying is that the grammar of ancient Greek and Latin are extremely difficult, and that fact reflects the greater degree of specificity these languages afford their users. There's more meaning packed into each word due to the fact that, for the most part, what is at the end of them provides information that would require more than one word to convey, say, in English, or even German, or Russian, or any other modern language. There's something about these ancient, something about these dead, something about these, ready for this, highly inflected languages that deserves study, yes, but beyond that, requires us to attend to the depths of meaning uncovered within the pages of the ancient writers employing these languages that enable them to go so deeply into things. Because then it will influence our own thinking and our own ability to think subtly in that manner, despite using relatively uninflected languages. So what do I mean about inflection? Let's get into that first. When I say inflection, I mean changing a word to mean something different depending on how it fits within the structure of the sentence it belongs to. In other words, syntax. There are two aspects to grammar. And I get into this in another video. You click on there, and I recommend you watch it. It's my most popular video on this channel, at least so far, and I put a lot of work into it. And so I'm not going to repeat too much of what I talk about in there, but suffice to say that yes, there are two aspects to grammar. There's morphology and syntax. Morphology simply means the logi, right? The logos, the study of shapes. Isn't that interesting? It's the changing of words you do that gives them different statuses within their respective sentences. So the sentence is the basic unit of meaning in language is the sentence, supposedly. I don't buy it, to be honest. I think it can be the syllable, depending on the context in which it occurs. So if I go, well, that was a pretty meaningful syllable. Whereas if I go invertebrate, the t before the very last syllable, little less intrinsically significant, semantically speaking, than the thing that I did earlier. The sentence is the unit of getting a point across. Sententia in Rome literally meant opinion. If you think about that, that's pretty interesting, isn't it? So you have embedded in the very idea of using sentences, stating opinions. There's an equation here. And it suggests a humility in the human attempt to come to terms with things. No matter how certain you think you are about something, you are stating your opinion that you are certain based upon, for example, as we would talk today, you not being in a simulation. That's my favorite. When we talk about the ancients trying to come to terms with their environment, for good reason, we speak first of all about myth and the myths that were used to grapple with realities that seem to evade at least current, what we would now call scientific, but call proto-scientific in their context, knowledge. And so you come up with stories to come to terms with thunder, earthquakes, erotic passion. There's an Olympian for each of those, right? Well, when people engage in conversation, turning with each other is the etymology of that, people use language. And depending on how deeply you go into what you say, you come more or less close to the real juice of what there is to detect about what it is you're looking at together. So a difficult language possessing a difficult grammar is difficult on both the morphological and on the syntactic side of things, the two aspects of what constitutes grammar, which is used in order to construct sentences in a logically coherent way that everyone agrees to the terms of and calls communication. Communication meaning munai being walls, and the com means together. So you have people living within the same walls, speaking together using a language that enables them to bridge differences between them in the minds they live in, separate from each other. When you read the Socratic dialogues of Plato, you witness people making use of this fine-honed tool of the Greek language to its utmost capacity. Not only resting on the laurels of a difficult syntax, but exploiting it to stretch the human capacity to unravel aspects of reality, evading more simple ways of stating things. Simplicity and clarity have not always been unadulteratedly positively received by critics and theorists of literature throughout the ages. There's also something to be said for their opposites. In fact, there was an entire epoch, epoch, of ancient Greek history in which there was a kind of cult of difficulty at Alexandria. The librarians, especially Callimachus, priding himself on the difficulty and obscurity of what he wrote. And yes, someone like Heraclitus, long before him, served as harbingers for this tendency. But Callimachus is famous for good reason for instituting a new way of doing poetry where it's unabashedly so difficult that it requires an apprenticeship to even come to terms with, let alone understand to its depths. But more on that in future videos. Let's get back to language. Let's get back to the language that Callimachus and Homer were both using, despite being separated by hundreds and hundreds of years. But rather than start out abstractly, I'd like to provide you with a concrete example or two to give you a sense of what ballpark we're dealing with here when I talk about the advantages, creatively speaking, of ancient so-called dead languages over modern so-called alive ones. It's all about freedom. The freedom to be able to put words wherever you want them to be on any line of poetry. Because when you talk about the utmost freedom of the artist to use words in certain ways, you're talking about not only the way they fit within their sentences, but also how they fit onto the page, how they look, how they are arranged, which words go with which, and then you're on to the next line and the next. The first politicians were poets. Solon, when he proposed his renovations to Athens, didn't give prose speeches, but he sang songs in verse to the Athenians to convince them to think in a certain way, to take one course over another, etc. If in English I say, the dog goes to the park, how much freedom is involved in the use of the actual words in that sentence? To the park is 3 words in English. Not only is it 3 separate words, 2 can be used in so many different ways. The, same thing, even more so. And park can be used in many different ways as well, as the subject of a sentence, the direct object, indirect, etc. But you are taking these 3 words, each of which should be allowed to do what it needs to do anywhere within any line of poetry in order to fit into its music the way the poet wants it to. But now, because of the trade-off from what is most valuable about the expressive capacities inherent in ancient languages, being obliterated because of their difficulty, simplified into, diluted into their modern guise. Now, the trade-off is that you don't have one word filled with 3 or 4 different semantic aspects that can be moved around together anywhere you want them to be. In a line of poetry, on the next line, at the end of the third line down, when we look at Horace, you'll see what I mean by this. Now you're required to have 3 words stuck together that intrinsically belong together no more than if you put a ring next to a cup next to a couch. 3 different things that by custom are considered to have to stick together in order to mean something in a sentence. Well, think about how constrained the poet is in having to have those words stuck together like that every time that phrase is used. What if those 3 words could be congealed into a single word, and that word could be used in the first, second, third, or fourth portion of a given line of poetry in relation to another cluster of meanings and another and another. And then you have the next line. And so you could have something at the beginning of the first and at the end of the second that correspond to each other in an important way. Try that in English. More often than not, you're going to end up having to tax the capabilities of the English language in a way that is either valued, as in Joyce's case, or considered to be pretentious or some other pejorative quality that people who look down upon such verbal exploration would be likely to refer to it as. And so we learn these so-called dead languages in order to be able to appreciate a poet using words the way a composer uses tones. A composer can place tones anywhere they need to be on a score because each of these tones is independent from the others, harmonize or disharmonize with each other, however the composer wishes them to. There aren't any tones that have to stick together. That would be grace notes, for example, that are embellishments that are by no means essential to the tone itself. But in language, the trade-off was getting rid of those high-impact words, those grammatically rich clusters of meaning, requiring a deep understanding of an extremely, almost unprecedentedly difficult grammar, morphology and syntax to come to terms with. So I feel like I've talked long enough in this video, but I will say that in the future I will make other videos going deeper into these aspects of language, ancient languages, the dead languages, the highly inflected languages that are unlike their descendants when it comes to creative capability. Comment below if you have any questions or want me to go deeper into any other aspects of this, and I'll be happy to do so. I'm using your questions, your emails, your comments, etc., as springboards for making these videos. And if you're curious about any of this, let's get into it down there. And then I'll just keep making these things.